Hello everyone, welcome to this South Wales Institute of Directors events. If you feel comfortable to do so, please put your camera on so standing on this virtual stage doesn't feel so lonely then, and I can look at your wonderful eyes looking back at me.
He's such a charmer.
I am going to be delegating this talk over to Andrew Payne, but I'm not going to formally introduce because he's more than capable of doing that himself, and I'm going to let him take over. But for anyone on this call that is a non-member of the Institute of Directors, if you'd like to find out more about what the wonderful organization can do for your business, please reach out to me afterwards, and my PA Laura Payne will put my contact details in the chat, and we will have a chat and see if the Institute of Directors is for you. But for all those members, thank you for joining, and I'm going to hand over to Andrew to take us through that wonderful thing, which is delegation.
Thanks, Damien. Yeah, I wonder, before I sort of introduce myself, and I'll keep the introduction brief, but before I do that, I wonder if there's anyone here who's ever given a job to someone else to do, and you thought you were pretty clear about what needed to be done, but the other person made a mess of the job, leaving you wishing you'd just done it yourself. Like, it would have been quicker, it would have been easier. And I wonder if there's anyone here who has ever given someone a job to do where, having been burnt once before in the noble art of delegation, this time, not only are you pretty clear about what needs to be done, you also produce a list of step-by-step instructions, so there is no possible way that the other person could screw the job up. But they still screw it up. And you're left thinking, what is wrong with people? You know, it is tough being a professional when you are surrounded by amateurs, clowns. I wonder if there's anyone here who's ever outsourced a job to someone else to do. You were paying them for their expertise. Maybe you were setting up your own restaurant. You needed the flooring to go in, so you hired Lino Ritchie. You were clear, you thought you were clear to Lino that it needed to be finished by the end of the week, had trades coming in the following week. You were launching your restaurant 3 or 4 weeks' time, but Lino goes AWOL. He's gone off to another job. Oh, I'm sorry, there's another job, there's a few problems on another job. We reckon we'll be finished by the middle of next week. And you're thinking, what part at the end of this week did Lino not understand? Delegation, it should be quite straightforward, and yet it causes a lot of heartache. And typically, there are 3 different scenarios in which we tend to delegate. And I'm just going to try to share my screen here and see if I can get us into a slide deck. From my end, it's going quite well. Zoe, can you just wave to me and tell me that you're seeing a screen with 3 scenarios of delegation on it? Yeah, it's all good. Cool. So these are typically the areas where we tend to delegate. Sometimes we're going to delegate to someone because we don't need to give them the job, but it just makes sense. They're better skilled for that job. They'll do it more quickly than we would. Sometimes we're paying a consultant like Lino Ritchie. Sometimes you're giving the job to someone to do because you want to develop their skills and you want to free up your own time to do other things. It may not be that that other person is better at doing that job, but you recognize that there are some major wins for you in delegating that job. And so again, when you look at this and you think, well, it's all straightforward. There shouldn't be any heartache, but there is heartache, and partly there's heartache because so few people receive specific training on how to delegate. I was doing a webinar on delegation to a group of project managers last month. There was 250 project managers on the webinar, and 85% said they'd never had specific training on how to delegate. And you thought, for a project manager, delegation is quite an important skill. But those project managers are not alone. In fact, there was some research done and it was quoted in a Harvard Business Review, where they surveyed 332 large American companies And of those, half of them were saying they were concerned about their employees' poor delegation skills. So that's roughly sort of 165 of those 332. And yet only 28% of those 165 are going to do anything about it. So out of a survey of 332 companies, you've got 100 who are expressing concerns about their employees' poor delegation skills, and they're not going to do anything about it. You have to wonder what the impact is really on the bottom line for those companies. What's the impact on business leaders who, because they don't know how to delegate, or maybe they've tried to delegate and it hasn't gone well, they're now holding on to all these jobs? What's the impact of burnout? And then all the things that go with burnout, such as time off sick, resignations, or poor mental health while you're trying to juggle your role. What's the impact on teams who are deprived of the opportunity to step up and develop? What's the impact on teams who they've been delegated a job to do, but the handover has been really poor? So with only half the information, they've done the best that they can, but it's not the outcome that the delegator wanted. And then there's frustration on both sides. So my name's Andrew Payne. I help business leaders to thrive in their roles by getting more done, but without getting burnt out. And these are typically the areas that I talk about, that I coach on, that I work with people on. And obviously you can see that delegation is in that. And so you might be thinking, well, obviously, when it comes to delegation, Andrew's the main man. He's obviously a bit of a guru. And I like to think I'm a lot better at delegation than when I started out in my working career. You see, the first job I got in the 90s was in recruitment, because like back in the 90s, if you didn't know what you wanted to do, you just went and became a recruitment consultant. And I remember on that first day turning up to the office, and I didn't really know what a recruitment consultant was, but I figured, listen, it's got consultant in the title, so it's probably quite a good job. And anyway, I struggled in recruitment, but I finally got to that point in a couple of years where I had my own team of 4 or 5 people underneath me. At last, the firm have recognized my true talent. I felt that this post was truly deserved and long overdue. And I thought I would be a fantastic leader, because unlike all the other really aggressive people in the office who are just really sort of cutthroat and a wide boy sales type, I was a nice guy. I was a bit of a thinker. My team would love me. And so when it came to delegation, my view of helping people and of delegating to people is you throw as much information at them as you possibly can, again and again and again, and eventually some of it will stick. So for example, if I was to delegate the making of a cup of tea to my team, I'd have done something like this. I'd have made sure every single angle was covered. So there's no way that the clowns in my team could possibly mess this up. I'd have gone through it step by step. I'd have made sure that they'd know which step followed the next, that the sequence was all right, and that they didn't deviate from my plan at all. And of course, because this is how I led my team, within sort of a few months, their results were going nowhere. And I, of course, blame my team. It had nothing to do with my leadership. I actually moved company because I wanted to work with a better caliber of team, a better caliber of employee. Now, I've come a long way in my delegation skills. I've been on a long-term coaching journey, but there are so many mistakes typically that we will make when we delegate if we've not had specific training. And so in this session, these are the things we're going to look at. We're going to look at some of the common mistakes that people make so we can avoid making those mistakes. We're going to then look at the 3 pillars of effective delegation on which good delegation sits, and then the 6 must-do points of a good checklist. So we're going to avoid the things not to do, and we're going to do the things to do. But before I do that, I wonder, maybe Kerry, you can jump in here and unmute. I'm picking you because I can see your face. Unfortunately, you've appeared on my gallery, so you're in the firing line. But can you think of a scenario of delegation where either you've been the delegator or the delegate, or you've witnessed the delegation handover going on somewhere else? Can you think of any examples where you've seen it really badly done? And can you think of why it was so badly done? And if you can't think of one, don't worry, just nominate somebody else to share.
The thing that's coming to mind is the whole communication bit. So sometimes I think I've been really clear, but of course communication is a two-way street, isn't it? And most of the people in my team are quite young, so not very experienced. And so I think I'm being very clear, but maybe they're not, and they're not getting what I mean, because maybe they haven't got enough background information. And it does cause frustration, but usually in that situation, I blame myself because I'm communicating to them. So if they don't get it, I can't blame anybody else really, because I should have been more thoughtful. And I think going back to your sort of example with the list, I think where I've done similar sort of things, I think in the end, probably a better approach would be to get them to do the list, and then you'll test out whether they understand it.
Sure. Great. Excellent. Thank you for that, Kerry. Do you want to nominate one other person?
Zoe?
Zoe.
So this is me doing something wrong, so me not delegating. Can I use that example instead?
Yeah, yes, yeah, no, absolutely.
So where I used to work in a bar, this gent called Philip was training me, and he was like, could you cut all the fruit into slices, but you know what to do with the limes? And I was like, yeah, all right, I'll do that. And it was like my second shift. So I cut all of the fruit into slices, including the limes. And then on my third shift, I got a message in our staff group chat, and he had taken a picture of the limes, and he was like, who has cut these limes like this? Because they were meant to be cut into wedges, but obviously he had only told me to cut all the fruits into slices. So then all of the limes weren't prepped properly, because I thought he was delegating quite a simple task to me, and I messed up because the communication wasn't there.
Great. That's a really good example, Zoe. Can you choose me one more person to share an example of bad delegation?
Jonathan.
Jonathan, can you unmute and share?
Yeah. When my wife passes me a baby at the start of a conference, it's probably bad delegation. Anyway, I think just going back to repeat an earlier comment on the communication, I think during COVID, it's been very easy for bad delegation just through email threads, because you can lose the context of what actually needs to happen. Even though you'd have thought written instructions would be better, it's a bit like your tea example. I think you think you've said what you need to say even in writing, but you miss things, and you don't have that interaction to ask a couple of questions. So you find you've lost a whole week because someone's gone away and worked and they haven't. Even though we're more accessible than ever, you still find you don't have that interaction you'd usually have in an office environment. So I think it's very common at the moment to have bad delegation.
Yeah, no, thank you. No, that's great. That's really helpful. And I'm going to add one that I saw recently in a charity I was doing some work with, where there was an operations manager who's very direct, who there's no filters. She says it as she says it. She has high standards, very driven, very impatient. And she unfortunately had line management responsibility for a guy who didn't have a lot of confidence, was kind of feeling his way in the role, quite quiet. And so when she would give him a job to do, she would just get so angry with him so quickly if he didn't do it as she liked. But then it created this pattern that whenever she gave him a job to do, the man was terrified and he turned into a bumbling fool. And so it wasn't necessarily specifically about just the one task, but the dynamic, the relationship dynamic was entirely wrong for a helpful delegation process to take place. And it wasn't, whenever she delegated to him, the man was falling apart. In the end, he left the company, and I don't blame him. So there are different angles to poor delegation. But let's look at the 6 most common mistakes now that I observe in the leaders that I work with, and from my own behavior in the past. And helpfully, they spell an acronym. You got to love acronym, right? So there's 6 dastardly crimes, and we'll work through them one by one. So the first is control, where you give a job away, but you still want to control how that job is progressed very closely. And the danger point with this is the handover, because you want to still control it, is more often than not a list of long instructions, which is boring to be on the receiving end of. And even if you're someone who's super qualified and super focused, if you're bored and you're receiving lots of instructions, number one, there's only so much you can take in any one given time. Number two, if you're bored, you are more likely to zone in and zone out. And so you'll only get half of the picture. And more often than not, if you've only got half the picture, you'll just go with half the picture. You won't say to the person when they're finished, oh, listen, can you go back over those instructions? Because I was actually thinking about my shopping because you were going on for so long. No one's going to say that. And so when we still try and retain this control step by step of how the job's going to be progressed, that is a danger point. We have to understand that when we delegate a task, we will need to relinquish some control of how that task is progressed. The second thing that I see is just that people do it in a rush. That the reason you're delegating is you're overstretched. So you just want to dump the task quickly. So you want to tell the person what they need to do. There's no time for a long conversation, working through danger points, having that two-way flow, because that takes up time, right? You're just going to chuck out some instructions and hope it sticks. But of course, then are people listening? Will they remember? Have you covered all the angles? Or have you actually cut corners and there are parts that are missing? The third danger point I see, and Kerry, you referred to this in the what you were sharing about communication, is we think we've been clear, but actually modern language is really ambiguous. I mean, what does do a good job on this mean? If I ask my teenage daughter to tidy her bedroom because it's in a state and I want it neat and tidy, what does in a state look like and what do neat and tidy look like? Her version of state, neat and tidy will be very different to my version. So immediately, unless I clarify what I want, we're going to end up with a disappointing outcome, which could put pressure on the dynamic of my relationship with her and me. She could try really hard in her head and in her mind, she's done her best and it's just never good enough for me, and I wasn't that clear anyway. So we need to really clarify our language and really pick our language apart when we hand over a task. Are there parts of this handover that are actually quite ambiguous and open for interpretation? Myopic. Now, some of you might be thinking, has he chosen myopic just so he can fit this into his C.R.I.M.E.S model? He needed a word to begin with the letter M, so he's gone for myopic. I mean, you could say short-termism is the same thing, and obviously if I had short-term, then there wouldn't be an acronym, so you might have rumbled me there. But myopic, short-termism, this is where your focus is to just get rid of the task. That's what you need to do to free up time. Whereas the very best delegators, they take a longer term strategic approach to delegation, thinking about who can I develop? How do I develop them? Are they ready for this job? How do I help them to step up? How do I set this up so that they can't fail? Or maybe how do I set it up so that they could fail? Because one of those tasks where actually failure is okay and I'm growing them. But there's a much longer term strategic approach where the effective delegators take, rather than just, I need to free up my time, I need to get rid of this task. Because if that's your sole focus for delegation, then you are likely to cut corners on the way that you hand over. The other thing is ease. And as a sole entrepreneur, often when I delegate, the last thing I want to do is get loads of quotes and do my research. I just want Bob from down the road, who I've heard is a printer, to just do me some printing. And so often this need for ease, for just, I mean, we are naturally lazy as people. We will naturally, the anchoring bias is where we will put too much emphasis on the first piece of evidence that we receive because we don't want to sift through all the rest of the evidence. And so that's often how we buy, it's often how we outsource. And so even as sort of sole entrepreneurs, when we outsource, we need to be careful of this desire for ease, so that we don't rush into a process with a company that we haven't properly vetted. And I have my own little processes in place that stop me from doing that. Very recently, a speaker bureau approached me, and I should have had my red flags flying, and they were full of flattery. They really buttered me up. And the point is that it costs £500 for them to list you. And as a speaker, speaker bureaus should be free, and then they take a cut for each booking. But I almost signed up because this guy was so good. And then I was like, no, hang on. I need to go through my 4 W's when I outsource, which is he needs to understand what I'm all about and the what that I deliver. He needs to understand the why and why I deliver what I do. And he seemed to do those quite well. He needs to understand timescale. We were good on timescale about when, his timescale was fitting mine. But the crucial last point that I go through when I outsource or when I invest in something is, well, who has he done business with recently that I can speak to? And so I went through his gallery, I spoke through to 7 of the speakers he represented, and not one of them had a piece of business off him. But it took me some time and effort to sift through some of his speakers and set up those conversations so I could see whether this was a worthwhile thing. And I have that process in place because I know that ease causes me to jump in too quickly sometimes as a lone entrepreneur. The last is selection. And obviously, as leaders, it's easier to give a job to someone who's conscientious, who's going to say yes quickly and easily. It's easier to do that than to give it to Richard, who's really difficult to handle. Apologies, I don't think we've got anyone on this call called Richard. But let's say Richard is really difficult to handle and he's had a bad week and he's grumpy, but maybe Richard is the right person to ask. Maybe Richard has the spare capacity, and Matilda, who's hugely conscientious and never says no, she'll say yes, but she doesn't have capacity. So we need to be really careful on our selection, that we don't just ask yes people, that we're really clear, is this person ready for the task? If not, can I help them step up to the task, not only in terms of skill set, but also in terms of capacity. 6 dastardly crimes. I'm not saying you must never commit these crimes when you delegate, because that would be ridiculous. Sometimes you are going to delegate in a rush. What I am saying is where you commit these crimes, you could be compromising your handover. So beware, they are danger signs when you delegate, because what we want are the best possible outcomes. So if those are some of the things to avoid, then what do we need to do? Well, I've got 3 critical pillars, and as the first is conversations, one of you referred to earlier, the problem with email is we can miss context, there can be misunderstanding, a two-way flowing conversation. Now, as delegators, I don't know whether you resonate with this, but it's so good, isn't it, to give advice, to tell someone how to do something and sound knowledgeable. It's so good to feel that we are imparting our wisdom on people who are listening intently to us, and they're now going to do what we've asked them to do. But actually, good delegators, they get that two-way conversation going, because they know that if they do all the talking, the other person will get bored. So they make sure that the other person has input into how this task is going to progress. They'll make sure that they're asking the other person questions so that the other person is talking, not in an interrogative style, but in an open, flowing conversation kind of a way. Good delegators will not do all the talking. They will be conscious that as people, we want to sound knowledgeable, but that won't necessarily set up a good handover. And of course, in good conversation, there is a balance. There are so many questions that you can ask. And of course, there will be times where you will have to give instructions. I'll give you an example. With the GDPR stuff that came in, I was doing some work with a warehouse, and the drivers, there was some concern that, you know, there would be some GDPR breaches, and could I do some GDPR training with the drivers? And I'd done some previous work with this warehouse, so I went in and I thought, well, I don't know whether I need to do any training with them or not. So I made them all a round of tea and went out and met them in the workplace and just was like, hey, you know, the GDPR stuff, have you heard about it? And they were like, yeah. So I was asking them, well, can you see any areas where that could affect you in your work? Can you see any areas where maybe you guys need to tighten up? And they came up with all the answers themselves. They didn't need a training session. They already knew it. They needed a conversation and then some kind of agreements that they could stick to. Good delegators make sure that it's a flowing conversation, that there might be some instructions where there are gaps in the other person's learning, but as much as possible, you're going to draw out that other person's knowledge with questions, because you don't know necessarily what they know. I didn't know whether those guys knew their GDPR or not. They actually knew quite a lot about it. The third critical pillar of great delegation is, of course, respect and rapport. And you probably all knew I was going to say that. There is a difference between respect and rapport. You know, I can respect someone and their judgment and find them just too harsh and honest, but I do respect their judgment. I can see that. And I can be in good rapport with someone because they're funny and not trust a word they say, because I know that they always exaggerate. But ideally, you want respect and rapport in place. So you imagine I've had a terrible weekend with my teenage daughter. We've got on badly. We've rowed. She's been ridiculously obstinate. Of course, I'm always right, and she never is. No, but we've had a bad weekend. Then I ask her to tidy her room, and I try and set up this two-way flowing conversation. What do you think the chances are of me setting up a helpful two-way flowing conversation about her tidying her room when we've had a shocking weekend? I mean, it's just not going to happen. There's going to be no helpful conversation. At best, she's just going to stand there sullenly and look at the floor. However, if we've had a great weekend together and we're in good rapport, there's a good level of respect two-way at that time, then I'm asking her, and we have that two-way conversation. Of course, we're going to have a helpful conversation and she'll probably do the job really well. But the same that happens at home between a parent and a teenager will happen in the business place. We've got to make sure as leaders that we are looking at, well, what do I do in my business that actively builds respect? And what are the practical steps that I do in the way that I lead that actively builds rapport? And what are the things that I might do that on reflection could break some of that down? And what's the balance between both? Because if you want to delegate effectively so that you can free up time, so that you can develop a resourceful team, these two things, respect and rapport, do need to be in place. So those are your three critical pillars. So what are the 6 things that you need to include in an effective delegation checklist? I'm going to share 6 things with you. They all begin with the letter R, which is quite helpful. And I'm not saying you must do all of these 6 every time you delegate, because obviously sometimes you are going to delegate a cup of tea and there's not a lot to that task. But the more complicated the task that you're delegating, the more that's at stake, the more of these letter R's I would suggest you have in place. The first is reality check, a really good reality check on the person that you're selecting to do this task. Is it the right person? If they're not the right person, are you giving them the task because you think that they need to step up and they could step up, but in which case they may well need a greater level of support than if you gave that task to someone else, but it may still be right for you to give that task to this person that you're trying to develop. But really have a sit down and a reality check, because if you're giving a task to someone to do and they're not yet ready for it, then how are you going to manage your expectations? What are you going to achieve from this so that you can be pleased with what that person has done, so that you can genuinely encourage them and develop them? So important when you delegate that the other person sees the same outcome that you see. It goes back to this language about clarifying rather than implying. Check back when you delegate, when you finish the task, you finish the handover. What does the person believe that needs to be done? What is the outcome that they see? It needs to match your outcome. And within this, what authority do they have? And this is often a frustration I find with business leaders, where they've delegated a task, but then the person they've delegated to, in wanting to take the initiative, they've completely overstepped the boundaries. So in achieving this result, this outcome that you both see, how much authority will your delegate have? That needs to be set. What are the risks? And this is a great way to get that conversation flowing. Can you see any problems with this task? Can you see anything we need to be really careful of? Those are the kind of just really easygoing questions that get the person thinking and engaged in the task, so you're not just talking at them the whole time, but be clear that they know what the risks are, where the problem bits of the task could be, that they've been able to flag it up and they understand how they're going to attend to that task with those risks in place. Another common complaint I hear from people that like delegating is that they've delegated the task and then the person they've delegated to just comes back and nags them to death, asking them for clarification on things they've said 100 times before. So when you set up the task, you need to clarify what resources that person could draw on. Again, you can ask questions to get them thinking about who they could speak to, where they could research what they need to research. But how much help can the delegate ask? Do you have an open door policy as a leader? In which case that might be fine, but your door needs to be permanently open and you might get nagged to death. Or do you expect your delegate to go away and try and deal with the problems, and maybe there's 48 hours you expect? What are the parameters? It will vary from person to person, from task to task. And bear in mind, different people are at different stages in their life, different people have different challenges. Just because someone needs a lot of help on a task doesn't mean they're any worse than a person that doesn't need much help. They could just be facing different stuff at the moment. What kind of support checking in process is the other person going to need? There are some people that really value lots of hand holding for whatever reason, and there are some people that can't stand it. But for the people that can't stand it, do they need some hand holding? That kind of checking in process needs to be established at the beginning so that there's no unnecessary frustration. And like I say, for those, I mean, I'm one of these nice people where I like to have an open door policy, but it's not good for people in terms of their development if they know they can just keep coming back to me and asking me and asking me, asking me. At some point, you have to encourage them to think for themselves, experiment for themselves, but be very clear that is covered in your handover. Ramifications. Do they know the other person? Can they see what the ramifications are of doing a job well and a job done badly? Because sometimes people lose enthusiasm for a job if they don't see the true value of doing it really well. And it's not about putting fear into them, but it's about helping them to see, well, look, what are the implications if we do this really, really well? What could happen? What could happen? What are the wider ramifications if we don't do this job really well? Who does it impact? How does it impact them? These, again, really useful parts of conversation to have with someone so that when they set off to do that task, they see the bigger picture. They see how that task feeds into that bigger picture. And of course, the last is relationships. How are you going to handle things if the person is falling behind? How are you going to handle things if the person messes up? How are you going to develop your relationship with that person through the delegation process so that constantly you're helping that person to create you're helping them to create a habit where they're reflecting and they're trying to improve. They're not just doing the job and going through the motions, because your relationship with people, particularly now with COVID and there is so much fear, there is so much burnout, there is so much uncertainty. Your relationship with your delegate through this delegation process is a crucial part of that job being done well. Once that relationship starts to break down, and I've alluded to this with the charity, with the very direct talking operations manager, if the relationship is breaking down, that delegation process, it will be a disaster ultimately. It has to rest on a strong relationship. So we've looked at some danger signs. We've looked at some pillars of delegation. We've looked at a checklist where I'm not saying you need to do every R when you do a handover, but I am saying the more complex the task, the higher the stakes of the task, you need to do more of these R's. What I want to do now is hand back to Damien. And if there's anyone's got any questions about delegation or for further clarification, let's open that up now, Damien. If I stop sharing my screen, that might help. So,
can I just say, Andrew, thank you for that. That was amazing. That was amazing. Has anyone got any questions, any reflections, anything that they do within their roles that they'd like to either ask questions about or anything they want to know more on?
I had an interesting observation today, which I thought I'd share, which was an example where the delegation worked really well. So as I mentioned earlier, most of my team are quite young, and one of my new staff, who's not very confident, she sent me an email asking for about 6 bits of information, which was quite basic, like a payroll number and our company address and things like that. So I asked her to go find the information herself and told her where to look for it. And after about an hour or so, I didn't hear anything. So I was getting a little bit worried. So I got in touch with her, and she found all of it and dealt with it and had felt much more confident as a result. So I was really pleased, because sometimes you come back to yourself when things go wrong, but it's good to recognize when things go right as well.
Excellent. Thank you. That's really helpful. Okay. Thank you for sharing. Is that there's a final part that I'm going to look at in a moment, but again, are there any general observations? Anyone else got anything that, or any questions maybe about what we've discussed?
I can't see your name, sir, because of my disability, but I can see you've got your hand up. So please feel free to share your point or ask a question.
Thank you. It might be that I'm jumping to the end, but it was more about how you close the feedback loop at the end with giving thanks, but making it kind of genuine thanks and not just an email saying thank you. So how do you balance giving praise in the right way, and also how do you, have you got any tactics about how to give constructive criticism in a virtual format, which we're having to do at the moment, which is, I find, very difficult?
I think so. Two different questions. I think with praise and thanks, you know, I remember I was playing in a church band. There was a point to me going off on this slight tangent, and I remember playing for the first time in this church band the trumpet, and I was all right at the trumpet. I wasn't brilliant, but I was okay. And the leader of the band, after the first time he came in and said, "Andrew, that was fantastic. You're amazing." And I remember thinking, I'm not sure I was, but okay, well, fair enough. I'll take that. That's always nice. Then the next week, somebody else started new, and he went up. I can't remember what her name was. I'll call her Katie just for the sake of it. You're like, "Katie, that was fantastic. You were amazing." I was like, "Oh, okay." He's one of those. So it wasn't genuine at all. And actually, he didn't say anything specific about why I'd been fantastic. And I think, and I do see a lot of people give praise. That's really good. It was fine. I often hear it was fine. Well, what does fine mean? So I think we have a duty as good leaders to pick out specifics. Otherwise, our praise is absolutely meaningless. And so in order to pick out specifics, we have to be quite attentive, actually, to, it's harder to pick out specifics because we've got to really pay attention if we're going to pick out specifics. So for me, you know, it doesn't make a lot of difference between, you know, someone could thank me on email, and that means a lot to me if there's a specific, just as much as it would if they picked up the phone. Virtually in person, doesn't really matter, as long as it is specific and genuine. I think with the constructive feedback, you know, there's a great little model that I use that I sort of stole from the worlds of sports psychologists. There's a sports psychologist called Mark Sheesby who challenged me. There's also a serial fraudster called Mark Sheesby, so you need to talk to the right Mark Sheesby. But the one that's a sports psychologist anyway, he challenged me when I was going through some tough times in my life to sort of look at some of the language patterns of the top Premier League football managers. And when you look at the very best and you look at the very worst, one of the things the very best do is when they express negative sentiments about something. So you could say a constructive comment, you know, we were not at our best today. At the moment, the team is not gelling as it should. They use deliberately temporary language that sets it up as a temporary problem. And so I think when we give constructive feedback, it's helpful that if we're working closely with people that we frame it as a temporary problem, which is really easy to do as long as you're using words like today, at the moment, right now, we're not where we need to be, that kind of language. It's also helpful. Top Premier League managers will draw in some of the external things that may have happened that were beyond everyone's control. Bad refereeing decisions, key players were missing. And you might think, well, that's just excuses. It isn't just excuses. It's taking the heat off the person a little bit. It's always helpful to consider some of the external stuff that may have impacted the event. There might be some learning within that. Then what they do is they look at some specifics. You know, what specifically went wrong? How specifically will we respond to that? And then they finish with something to be thankful for. It might be that they still created loads of chances. It might be that defensively as a unit, it might be the goalie was peppered with shots, but you only let one of them in. Whatever it is, they'll find something specific to be thankful for. And so I think when we give constructive feedback, we need some of these strategies because they work really well. And actually, if you give constructive feedback and take someone through a process like that, it's actually helpful. It builds rapport. It doesn't break it down. And I've seen Premier League managers go through that format with anger and passion, and it's still hugely inspirational to listen to. So I don't know if that helps.
No, thank you. That's really helpful. Thanks.
So anybody else, before I'm going to jump in then and ask you to think about, and I'm going to choose some people. I mean, it'd be very brave of me to choose people that are not on camera, because they might actually be out feeding their cat in the kitchen. But the for me, whenever we learn something, or whenever we attend one of these webinars, it's always useful to ask yourself, what am I going to start doing, stop doing, keep doing, and tweak doing? And keep and tweak are slightly different, because keep doing means I'm going to keep doing it exactly as it is because it works really well. Tweak doing is where I'm going to keep doing something, but I'm just going to slightly modify it actually, because I can make it a bit better on reflection. So Zoe, anything that you're going to start, stop, keep, or tweak doing, and then you can nominate someone else for me.
I think probably with my communication, I'm going to start elaborating a bit more, thinking that people don't know the softwares. So I keep referring to softwares that I use that I just think everybody knows, and then they come back and they're like, what is this? And I spend more time explaining myself. So that's probably something I'm going to tweak, go back to how I was when I started, not knowing everything that goes on, and then go from there instead of assuming people know.
Thank you. Okay, I really appreciate you sharing that. Gerard has messaged us to say he doesn't have a camera and microphone, so he's off the hook. But if you could nominate someone else.
I'll go with Rianne.
Rianne.
Is that me?
Yes.
Hello. It's sort of leading me to think about all sorts of things. So I'm wondering whether actually I need to follow up on some basic project management information and work as well, because I think some of the things I delegate are quite strategic and quite broad, with the expectation that the post holder would know how to develop their own project plan to implement. So there's lots of conversations, lots of communication, lots of checking in. But I suppose I'm thinking I need more of a formula at the beginning to think about what are the outcomes that we are trying to achieve with the piece of work. So I'm thinking, you know, maybe it's not just about delegation and what you're delegating, but how you then support that autonomy within managing the project for yourself.
That's great. And I would say with any formula, if you can make your own process and formula yourself, when you create your own stuff, it's just so much more powerful. I hope that some of the stuff I've shared gives you sort of a spark to then go and create your own stuff that will work really well.
Yeah.
Thanks. Cool. Do you want to nominate someone else, Rianne?
I will try. How about M. Hopkins?
M. Hopkins.
I just knew you were going to do that. I don't know why. I was waiting for it. Thank you. I think it comes back to communication, really, in terms of not assuming anything. I think there's a quote, I can't remember the exact saying, something around assuming that communication has taken place when it hasn't. So I think it's just not making assumptions that people know what they need to do in detail, because you've been working with me for X number of years, you should know. But I think it's about spelling out what it is. And somebody said this earlier on, what it is you expect from a task or whatever it is, and give them the autonomy. Somebody else said that as well, to be able to do it, and empower those you're delegating work to, trust them enough to do it however they want to do it. Don't be too explicit or prescriptive about how you want them to do it, as long as they get the results. And that would encourage them for whatever else you chuck their way.
Yeah, great. That's really helpful. Do you want to nominate one more person?
Andrew, if he's not been called already.
Am
I?
Well, other than me, I can't see anyone else on the call called Andrew.
Oh, that's just you. Oh, that's me guessing.
No,
Laura,
no,
has Laura been called?
Oh, Laura, no.
Hi. So my business is an outsourcing business, so people delegate to me. And the biggest thing for me is communication, and also that no question is too stupid.
Yeah.
I'm one of those people that will ask questions. If I don't get something, then I'll ask questions until I get it. And I think some people are too afraid sometimes to ask questions. I do a lot of mentoring for students in the university, and I always tell them, the first day I meet them is, if you're not sure of anything, just ask the questions. And I think by doing that, not only are you going to build a good relationship with that person, but you're also going to eliminate potential issues moving forward. Yeah, that's what I would say.
So it's so important. I used to think that if I didn't fully understand something, it obviously meant I was an idiot. Whereas now, if I don't understand something, although I realise there's the chance that I might still be an idiot, it could well be that the person just hasn't explained it that well. And you know, I need to be open to all possibilities. But I like what you're saying. You never be afraid to ask, even if you have to ask the same question a few times over because you just don't get it. Then that's okay. Much better than the other person thinking you do get it when you don't get it. Yeah, that's great. Does anybody else want to jump in? I'm conscious of the time, so I need to hand back to Damien shortly to close us off. Has anybody got anything else they want to add in? Because I know I haven't gone around everybody, but I'm just, like I said, I'm slightly conscious of time. Anybody want to add anything else before I hand this back to Damien?
Harry?
Yeah. Go on.
Just a thought from me. We've talked a lot about making sure we communicate to get the result we want, but also I think it's important to focus on the development of the person. So the one thing I'll take away is when we talked earlier on about conversational communication, try and sort of invest in the person who you're delegating to so that they develop in confidence and expertise so they get it better next time, because that's good for them. And I think all of us as leaders have got or should be motivated to try and develop other people to help them to be more successful. And I think there's a lot of satisfaction to be had from doing that.
I think 100%. And obviously, Kerry, and thank you for sharing that, bearing in mind that the more we develop the people around us and the more resourceful they become, you know, bearing in mind that we want to manage our time effectively, when we have a resourceful team that we can rely on, we can dump more tasks. It's just a win-win situation.
Yeah.
As long as we take that longer term approach. So thank you. No, that's really helpful. Well, in that case, it's 10 to 3. I'm going to hand back to you, Damien, just to close this off sort of 5 minutes early or so, which I don't think anybody's going to complain about. Is there anything you want to add, Damien?
I just want to use the closing couple of minutes to ask, is there any feedback about the general event that you want to give? If you don't feel you can give it now, please reach out to me via email, because it's only via listening to our members at the IoD here in South Wales that we can actually start making these events happen. Because actually, even though I'm the chair in South Wales, I'm only as good as the members I've got. So please come and communicate with me. I'm not somebody that wants to be a chair that stands alone. I want to be a chair that involves everyone. So when you see events from the Institute of Directors, especially here in South Wales and across Wales, really, bring your friends, let them know what the events have been like, because it's only through you that we can market our events. So please do that. And I'm gonna let you go and have a fabulous rest of your day, and thank you for giving me the privilege to spend time with you.